This is the cheat sheet review for the lesson titled Introduction to Classes and Objects, and that was CS-ISP 036. And it's mostly conceptual in nature. So let's just start off with some definitions or glossary terms, I guess you could say. So a class is a code block that defines a data type. All right, I guess. And an object is an instance of a class. And so I had several metaphors that I used, and these are helpful as you continue, at least when you get started. And so there's the difference between the blueprint and the house, right? Or houses. There's a difference between a recipe and let's say cupcakes. There's a difference between the pattern and, blue jeans. There's a difference between the cookie cutter and cookies. Okay? So that's the fundamental difference between the two, and keep that clean in your mind, and forgive people who use those interchangeably. So we also said that classes have members, like properties and methods, but there's others as well, as we'll learn about later. And so properties define the attributes that are set on an instance of the class, and they I didn't say this at the time, but they represent the state of the object at a moment in time inside the application. More about that later. Just, you might want to include that in for now. More importantly, you can set, or rather assign, and get, or rather retrieve, property values on an object. And then methods define actions an instance of a class can perform, usually on the object instance itself. So it usually works on its own members, but occasionally you can pass in an object and it will perform work on that object, okay? And more about that later. So you can create an instance of a class using the new keyword. And I said, think of it as a factory, right? Where it is responsible for taking the blueprint, the pattern, whatever, and it produces a new instance of that pattern or that blueprint, and it creates that in the computer's memory and then returns back a reference to that object in memory so that you can work with it. All right, and more about that a little bit later. You can access the members of an object by using the member access operator, rather the dot, like so. And conceptually, classes are delegated a responsibility in the system or represent some domain concept in the system, and more about that later. But when I use the term domain, I mean, like, for example, when we were building an application in the previous lesson that was for a car lot, a car is a domain object. It represents something about the problem that we're trying to solve. It is a representation in code of a physical or a conceptual idea that we're using and it's not like a utility. It's more of the main, the meat, the important part of the application. Okay, so it's the domain concept. All right, moving on. Classes are ultimately custom data types. You cannot lose sight of that from a pure C# perspective. More complex than the simple data types that we've been using up to this point. We've worked with. Therefore, you can use them anywhere you use other data types, like as input parameters or return values from a method, just as an example. Let's fix that. All right. And then we talked about some of the more practical bits about it as well. For example, you can just create a class car with an open and closing curly brace. You can create auto implemented properties, which are just simple versions of properties, and we'll talk about that more in an upcoming lesson. And you can just use the shortcut prop tab, and then also you can hit enter to go on and move on to the next line to add your next property. And then the final thing that I want to remind you about is the this keyword. It is used to access a member of the current instance of the class. So we were able to go something like public void my method, like so, inside of a class, and we were able to say this dot year equals 1976. All right, something like that. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up the cheat sheet review. Hopefully this will be helpful for you to refer to as we move on to more nuanced topics related to classes and objects in the upcoming lessons. All right, so hopefully that helps you out, and we'll see you in the next challenge. See you there. Thanks.